Welcome to 3-Night Weekend, where we prepare you for the weekend to come with the help of gaming industry luminaries. I'm Shane Satterfield, and you can find me on the world's most advanced gaming website, SIFTD, at sifted.net, or on Twitter at Dinfire. If you want to support us, head to patreon.com/sifted and drop us a pledge. The show goes live for our patrons on Friday and Monday for everyone else. This week, we talk with Frank O'Connor. He's been the face of the Halo franchise for almost 2 decades, but before that, he was a prominent games journalist. He's currently hustling to complete Halo Infinite before the end of the year, so his time is really valuable right now, and we appreciate him stopping by to chat. All right, it is my honor and privilege to welcome Frank O'Connor to 3-Night Weekend. Frank O'Connor has been the shepherd of the Halo franchise for over 17 years at this point. Frank, welcome to 3-Night Weekend.
Thank you very much. It's my pleasure to be here. And I would redefine shepherd as the angry, senile dog that runs around barking at anyone who comes anywhere near the farm. But I always, this is one of the things I always have to caveat is I have a job that puts me like kind of out front of a lot of people who are working, crazy hours to do impossible things. They're much harder than what I do. So it's always, kind of sucks as well, because you're like, practically everyone deserves more credit than I do, but it's also part of the job. So I think when I was young, it was terrifying, and I think I was a little bit more egoless, weirdly, when I was a kid, because I was just marveling at everyone around me. Mm-hmm. And over the years, you're just like, oh my god, I have to go back to the office, and they'll say, oh, you've been swanning around in the Far East, drinking cocktails and taking credit for our hard work. But
it's your job title, though. I mean,
yeah, sort of.
You are the franchise creative director for Halo.
Yeah,
I mean,
and clarify that as well. That means I'm in charge of the creative for the franchise all up. Still, a giant army of people working on my team and other teams. So, I'll work on game story, but at a sort of foundational level, where what kind of story are we going to tell? Is this going to be about the Master Chief? What kind of themes are we going to touch? So, and then you have a fantastic narrative team. Paul Crocker, he's new to me, but he's been working on Halo for many years.
How is that possible that he's new to you if he's been working on it?
Well, because he was brought on for Halo Infinite to be the narrative director for Halo Infinite, and it's not out yet. I don't know if you've checked.
Right.
But
I'm well aware.
Right. But he came from the sort of Batman series, and is incredible, and he's the guy obviously responsible for the storytelling. Joseph Staten is back, which is awesome. Again, that's one of those things that seems recent, but he's actually been here for ages now, and never really went away from me because he's been at Microsoft this whole time. But yeah, it's there again, not to sort of take my eye off my ball. I've got a lot of complicated responsibilities, and they're big, but also I just always want to make sure that the people who deserve the credit are getting it. And it's just one of those things about my job that kind of sucks, but it's great too, right? But I always have to tee up the real geniuses. So.
Well, you also have to take a lot of the shrapnel when things don't go well.
Right.
So...
I absorb a lot of death threats before they get to better people than me, which is great. So yeah.
And before we get started, I do want to give you a special thanks because, Halo Infinite wrapping up development. We know that's a busy time for the team. I just want to appreciate you taking the time out of your busy schedule to spend an hour with us and talk to all your fans. So let's actually start back in your younger years. You were a journalist. You may be the first journalist, seriously, to jump the line from journalist to developer. But I want to find out what brought you to that point. So tell us a little bit about your younger years with games. What were some of your favorite systems in games growing up? Have you always really been into video games?
Yeah, when I was a kid I grew up in Scotland. Went to school there as well. Spent the first part of my career there. Well, in the UK, and I was always into video games. I was. We were dirt poor. I'm not going to do the sob story, but really broke. I didn't have a TV, and so I tended to be borrowing other people's stuff or playing over at my friend's house. Remember one of my first friends when I was a kid, a guy called Craig Wood, had a Pong system. I can't remember which one because it was kind of irrelevant there, but it was 52 varieties of Pong, and then
Did it
a
include
friend.
Skeet as well?
Maybe
Because I
it
had
might
one
have
of
had the
those. I had a
guns.
Pong
I think
machine
guns
that also had the
guns were the
Skeet.
first thing to break, I think, right,
Yep.
on those systems. So
Yeah.
but then my I think where it really took off for me, just as a sort of wow, this is a pastime, not just a thing that happens to be there, was my friend Neil got an Atari 2600. I think we called it the VCS. It was called both
Yeah.
things here, but
Yep.
it
It was
was
called
the
both things in America
2600.
as well.
Yeah, and he was, he was similarly poor, but he had, he'd saved all his money to get an Atari, and he had Combat and Raiders of the Lost Ark, and we would just play those forever. So it was like really my first. That was actually my first experience of multiplayer gaming. Period.
I think for a lot of people it was.
Yeah, but also storytelling. So Raiders of the Lost Ark, the game it's got a lot of words from the movie, but nothing really makes any kind of narrative, literal sense. But those games really kind of blew my mind. And so then the next big thing I did in gaming that had any real meaning in my life was getting a ColecoVision. Like I bought it from
Arcade
like
perfect ports.
yeah,
Finally.
it was,
yeah.
I saved for it, and then I bought it from the UK equivalent of like Sears catalog. I don't think we had lingerie section like you guys do, but we had video games. And it was, I remember saving for it and scrimping, and that Coleco that changed my life. It was it did literally, as it turns out, but at the time I was like, this is it. And so, but then I was really into arcades, and it's just, that's one of the things is missing from the current gaming experience, right? There's so much other stuff and cool stuff, but the arcades, like literally the sort of the smell of arcades is like candy and soda and popcorn and sticky carpets and like
transistors
the sounds.
burning.
Yeah. And ozone. Yeah. And it was that was where it was magical for me. And arcades was also where you saw all the next technological and gameplay trends. So you would just go through the same cycles as the arcades, and you're waiting for, there wasn't much press about it. So it's not like you knew Marble Madness was coming out or Space Harrier was coming out. They just pop up and blow your mind. And that element of surprise was again, it was literally magical. It was like, Stranger Things, all sort of wrapped up in a real childhood. And that's where I knew I loved it. I didn't even know it was really a career until I remember reading about, I think it's Warren Robinett did the first major Easter egg in Adventure, and it was just his name. And I think that was the first time it occurred to me that people make these. Then the next game maker that I knew was David Crane, who did Pitfall.
Yeah.
But then again in the UK,
he was the first celebrity game developer.
Right. Yeah. And it was, some of it was deliberate, but it was also just like, he just had he himself was a better agent for himself than a lot of these other folks.
He also made the best games.
I mean,
let's be honest, his games on Atari 2600 were some of the best on the system.
Pitfall 2 on 2600 in particular doesn't even look like a 2600 game. It has like a little DSP or extra RAM or something in it, and it's just, again, insane. That game, it was at the end of the 2600's lifespan, but it looked like the beginning of a completely new generation. And like in a lot of ways, it's better than ColecoVision. It's like smooth scrolling and mind-blowing stuff, and the limitations they had to work with, like a 4K ROM. But again, I think
amazing what they did.
Well, that's the thing, and I don't mean to harp on about retro gaming, like like everything used to be better. But the one thing that is missing, I think, from kids' games now, and this isn't universally true, and things like Roblox and Minecraft make lie of what I'm about to say, but when you were playing, Defender or Wizard of War, whatever you were playing on these old 8-bit systems, you had to do a lot of filling in with your imagination in a similar way you do when you're reading books, right? When you're reading Harry Potter before the movies come out, you're imagining all this stuff. And
that's why box art used to be so important.
Yeah. Right. And that's
Atari
why
2600, like the cartridge and box art would basically tell you what you're supposed to be seeing while you're playing the games.
Right. And Activision, funny to keep harping on David Crane, but Activision had the most, I was never confused or felt ripped off by it as a kid, but their art used to look like screenshots, but they were like treated to like beautiful, like cell shaded sort of idealized versions of the graphics,
and they always had a rainbow on them. Like there was always a trail rainbow off some object in the box art.
I think that was on one of their original logo treatments as well. And it got confusing like something like 20 years later when Activision had another guy called David Crane working there, a very similar senior position. But but I loved all those games. And there's a lot of companies that aren't with us anymore, like Exidy and Bally and stuff like that.
Yep, absolutely. So you grew up playing games. How did your attitude towards games change to where you thought, you know what, I could actually maybe
Yeah.
work in this industry?
A little bit just from reading old video game magazines.
Mm-hmm.
There were really primitive. This is like I don't know if anyone's old enough to remember Omni and those sort of like tech futurist magazines, but there were also some video game magazines. Some of them were really amateurish. Some of these were sort of UK exclusive. But
Mm-hmm.
when I was young teenager and started reading these really famous British games magazines like Computer and Video Games, Zap 64, which was about Commodore 64. Crash was about the Sinclair Spectrum, which was like a worse 8-bit computer, probably making somebody rage about that. And the magazine company that made those, company called Newsfield, and they started trying to make celebrities of their writers. And again, you mentioned earlier that I was one of the first people to cross that sort of the
Journalist
bridge
developer
to
line,
become
yeah.
but actually it was one of the first, and by no means the first either, a guy called Gary Liddon. He worked on Zap 64 and a couple other magazines, along with sort of in their day legends like Julian Rignall, Jazz Rignall he was called, and they made them personalities and they gave them little little cartoons of the folks. So you'd see them, and they speak in this really irreverent, like screw the man sort of tone. And they were just fun, and they were like relatable, and they felt more like people you knew. And that was, those magazines blew up with that. And the UK game scene was really quite varied, and certainly compared to the US scene, which would kind of codify around one big system with a couple outliers. But the UK, during especially the 8-bit era, like there was BBC Micro, MSX, Spectrum, ZX81 was still going. The Oric Atmos wasn't, it was kind of a BBC, the Commodore 64, the Ataris, like they all kind of had a little bit of success. So you could kind of hop from machine to machine. That's one of the ways I used to get into different kinds of gaming was I would trade my, slightly more desirable but less powerful 8-bit computer for a more powerful but less desirable one, like an MSX, for example. Nobody wanted an MSX in the UK, but I did because they had Konami games and cartridges. Right. And so I did this sort of trade sideways thing, and that made me much more of a hobbyist, I think. And then by the time 16-bit rolled around, I was sort of into it. I had other interests like girls and school and stuff like that. But yeah, that was that era of arcades, 8-bit consoles, 8-bit computers was where I was like really excited and into it. It was before I got a job in the industry as well. So
okay, did you go to university or college in the
I did.
UK?
I went to a college in Edinburgh called Napier, and I did I think it was the first or the second year of their media studies degree, and it was really like they were working through it. It was a work in progress, but it was really broad. So I went in to do media studies, but then in that you basically got to pick a career out of the things you were doing. So it was like broadcast radio, broadcast television, advertising, really sort of quasi-related fields. But the most valuable part for me was you could intern basically most of the year, each year you were there. And you could stay on. A lot of folks, like, they graduated and then stayed with those companies. But I did a stint at an ad agency in the UK. That was the final internship I did was at a little ad agency, boutique ad agency in Edinburgh. But the first one I did was a video TV commercial company called In Video Broadcast, making TV commercials. So it was immediately exciting because like I was the boom mic operator.
I know that job very well.
I thought it was a super technical, awesome job. And it was in some ways, but it also just required that you had like, caveman body proportions by the time
really
you
strong
got to
forearms.
Yeah. And keeping it steady, super high pressure work environment,
keeping it out of the shot, most importantly.
And not shaking it because the audio engineer was like, I can hear you shaking. But that was the most compelling and useful aspect of that course, because I'd be learning like radio broadcast standards that were already defunct by the time we were learning them. So it wasn't, in a practical sense, the academics of it were useful. And they did, in a weird roundabout way, lead to my first job in the games industry. Because when I graduated, you get a grant from the Scottish government. Like, education is free if you meet certain criteria. It's actually great. I got a grant for, some of it was for like student housing, but some of it was for equipment that you need to do your for both your internship and your first job. And I got an electric typewriter with a little LCD screen. There was technically a word processor. You could do like one paragraph. Yeah, you do a paragraph, edit it, make sure you were happy with it, and then hit sort of enter, and it print it out. But it was really just a typewriter with a big cache.
Yeah.
And that thing. It was a brother. That thing is directly why I got a job in the game industry, because I was just looking for, when you're a kid and you ask your mom, hey, what should I draw? And they never tell you because they're busy being a parent. I was like, what should I write? And I was reading a computer magazine called New Computer Express. And it had video game reviews at the back. It was really quite techy, sort of 16-bit era. But they were great with news because it was weekly. So they had by far the most, you used to have to wait a week for news. So it was really 2 weeks in real time. And so I subscribed to that because that was the most current news. And at the back, they had an ad for a staff writer position they're in Bath, in England. Staff writer, barely need any qualifications. You just need to be a competent writer. Send us a sample game review of a recent game you played. So I'm like, perfect, something I can write. I wrote a review of Strider and the Genesis, or the Mega Drive, as we called it.
Mm-hmm.
And actually, technically, mine was a review of the arcade game because I didn't have the Genesis game. But that was
gotta be crafty.
I don't think they cared one way or another. It's not like they were going to publish it. But I sent that in, and I kind of didn't. I didn't really think I was applying for the job. I just thought, like, I'll go through the whole process. I can format the address. Like, if I didn't have to format that address and sort of formulate a CV, a resume as well, I wouldn't have done it. Like, it was just because I wanted to try out all the features on this typewriter. And I got a call 2 weeks later saying, can you come down and interview? So, like, I think it was like tomorrow or the day after. And that was that. I'd been out of college like literally a month, something like that. And then straight to my first job in the industry as a staff writer on a games magazine. That is
a very rare. We've talked to a lot of people on this show, and that is a very, very rare occurrence.
Yeah, and
my first job out of college was working at GameSpot. Like, again, just lucky. Had a really good guy, Joe Fielder, there who just was willing to talk to me about it and learn what my passions were, and actually took the time to check out the website I had been publishing. It everything just has to kind of fall into place in a lot of those cases. I think.
And that's that now as both a manager and sort of experienced like writer and editor. Like, what you're looking for is competent writing. You can teach people about Oxford commas. You can't teach them to be genuinely enthusiastic and knowledgeable in a broad sense. So that like when you bring in this kid, he's competent, he's literate, and or she's like coded some games, and you know what I mean? It doesn't matter what the thing is, but you recognize that passion is far more important in some ways than a lot of academic qualifications. It gets a little bit different these days, because I remember back when like Digipen was first starting out, we were watching it see as this, this is more for game development and journalism. Obviously, they're like, is this going to be any good? Like, are they going to work? And now, of course, you don't even think twice. That's a great qualification nowadays. And their curriculum and their academics are top notch. And there's more and more and more. The more mainstream colleges are starting to sort of catch up with that as well. So.
USC here in LA has a huge program now.
Oh my God,
for game development.
Yeah.
So it's great to see.
Yeah, and they bring, USC is a good example of bringing, I think Digipen has its own sort of legitimacy because it's so focused, but USC is another one where we see that in a resume. It's like, don't mean to crush anyone's dreams, but that's great if we see that in a resume.
Oh yeah, absolutely.
But again, that's typically not what you're looking for. You're looking for all these other things that surround it. And those qualifications, none of those qualifications mean anything compared to content. Like, if somebody supplies you, whether it's a game design, like that they've got working in Unity and you can play it and it's amazing, or if it's a beautiful polished piece of writing, whatever that thing is, like, qualifications are super useful and you got to get them, so stay in school. But content can sort of usurp any qualifications if it's amazing.
Yeah.
So if
To
you're
me,
genuinely talented,
qualifications
there are
help
ways
you
around
chop
that.
off, like when you get
Yeah,
500 resumes, it helps you
right.
chop out like 400 of them.
Right. Well, that's the other thing is like I do wonder how many resumes we've missed over the years by having someone else gate them for you, right?
Right.
Where I didn't get to see the content because they didn't graduate with a BA, or they didn't have 2 years of prior experience doing this, whatever it is.
Yeah.
So I do always worry about that when we're interviewing. But our Microsoft recruiting folks have got it down to science, so they're not going to filter things out because they're not perfect, and they'll figure out what a combination of things could look like as well. So
That's encouraging to hear. So eventually you became editor-in-chief of Official Xbox Magazine, and that's when I
yeah,
first discovered you. I was a big admirer of your work, thought you did a great job as a journalist. How did that come to be? How did you rise so quickly to become EIC at Official Xbox Magazine?
I'd been EIC on a couple of magazines. I'll be careful how I frame this, but I kind of always wanted to move to the States.
Okay.
It was like, but in a really primitive, dumb, like starry-eyed sort of way. Like it didn't hadn't been there a couple of times for work, and I loved it. But my idea of what America was like was really sort of media influenced, and
Yeah.
I wasn't a glassy-eyed starlet, like it didn't understand America is also a real place and stuff. But I loved it, and I wanted to move there, and I had the sort of idealized vision of it. I still carry, actually. That's one of the things I love about being here is most of the things I wanted to be true are true, right? So I was working in the UK at Future Publishing, which
Also
that
a
was my
big
first.
company.
Yeah,
Yeah.
and they had a US division, and I was everyone at our company was trying to go work there.
Hmm.
Only a couple of people did. Neil West and a couple other folks were already there. Mike Salmon actually was there in the early days. He was the EIC of Official Xbox Magazine before me, and we hop from magazine to magazine, like A, to keep them fresh, and B, kind of just rotate people, promote people in the video game magazine industry in particular.
Hmm. I mean, that's
Um,
typical of the magazine
yeah,
industry,
yeah,
no matter where you go.
absolutely.
Yeah.
Yeah, and you're sometimes people will say, "Hey, you worked on Next Gen." I'm like, "I didn't work on Next Gen." They're like, "Well, here's your button." I go, "Oh yeah, I used to write this thing for Next Gen all the time." In fact, I
Right.
wrote the Xbox column for Next Gen. I always forget that because it's just work. You're just
It all just blends together. That's
yeah.
why.
So you're often doing more than one thing. And um I was waiting for my turn to go to America and work for Future Publishing, and they were in Brisbane, California, which is amazingly south of San Francisco and north of South San Francisco. So you look it up on a map.
Yeah.
Um, and they had a little office in a warehouse, actually where the car chase from Bullet ends, the Steve McQueen film where the explosion happens at a gas station.
Wow.
That's actually their old office. Um, because there's a great like straightaway that you can do donuts on. Um, so I was trying to get a job there, and there were no slots open anyway, let alone like sort of visa stuff like that.
Hmm.
And then a company in LA that I knew from their video game publishing magazines, LFP. They published the Tips and Tricks magazine, which I loved. Chris Bieniak and those guys are amazing. And one of the editors there offered me a job. I'm like, well, what kind of job? Well, what is your visa situation? What's the salary going to be? Blah 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 blah. And I went there with the intention of launching this big glossy like next gen competitor. Everyone there was so lovely that I'm not going to say anything bad about anybody there. Like I was a little bit naive about what I was being promised necessarily,
Hmm.
but even more naive, I didn't know that LFP stood for Larry Flint Publications until I started and I got into the lobby, and it's like marble floor, Greek statues of nymphets. And I'm like, it's a little bit weird. And then I looked at all the people waiting in the lobby with me, and it was an interesting set of, like Ron
I have another
Jeremy's.
friend
And
who works there. You may
yeah,
even know her. Do you know Abby Heppy?
I know that name. I
So
think she was
she's now
after
the
me,
community
but yeah,
manager for Media Molecule on
yeah,
Dreams, but
yeah,
she worked at LFP.
yeah,
And you're aware because you worked in the industry
yeah,
how you constantly have PR people, developers coming to see you to
right.
demo games. And
Yeah,
then you record footage, you do an interview with them, and then
yeah,
they go to the next publication. Well, those people would have to come to Larry Flint's building and sit in the lobby with these
Right.
crazy hardcore
Yeah.
porn mags all
Yeah.
over the coffee table,
Yeah.
and then have to go in and do this very serious interview
Yeah.
or demo for this game. She
Yeah.
just said it was very awkward. And
I actually think for a lot of people, it was kind of exciting. It was this weird, risky thing they were going to do in their day job. But I was one of those people on my first day in the office, and right away I was like, I haven't been fully briefed, right? So I didn't spend that long enough. I loved LA, by the way, and I actually loved everyone I worked with. There's a lot of like really good journalists came out of there, weirdly enough, because a lot of people were going there to do something different and went on to write screenplays or went on to write like much more traditional stuff. But I'm not prudish, but like it wasn't just nude people monthly or sexual activity monthly. There were like really odd things, and it was and it was, I think I could have lived with it ethically if it just wasn't in your face, because there were loads of people there who didn't have anything to do with that, including me. You're once you're out of the lobby, you're kind of siloed away, and you would have no idea that it was that kind of publishing. But we were there when they filmed the movie People versus Larry Flint. I found an actor asleep in my office one day. That was exciting.
That's funny.
She was more famous for singing than acting. Anyway, it was exciting. But as soon as Future offered me a job in Brisbane, I jumped at the chance. So and moved north to San Francisco. Do miss LA, still like going back there, and luckily get to in my job. And worked on a couple of magazines there, and ended up on Official Xbox magazine
and
with Mike Salmon and those guys.
Yeah, you had a great run there, by the way. I thought you guys did an excellent job, especially for an official magazine related to a specific platform. I thought you guys really called it down the middle. You look at Nintendo Power or PlayStation Magazine, the reviews generally were inflated. I felt like you guys did a really good job, though, of keeping your editorial integrity.
It was funny, though, because I think we were great at staying out of like the idea that we're giving things, big scores because it's Microsoft. And that was part of the original agreement, was like, hey, you guys want the magazine to be authentic, right? So you can't control our editorial, right?
Mm-hmm.
We would, obviously, just as you do if you're writing a big story now, depending on the type of story, sometimes we'd have to run things by them, like, hey, we're going to be talking about, you told us this feature wasn't quite finalized, that sort of thing.
Mm-hmm.
But they never touched scores or even editorial. I think the only time I ever got into a spat like that with any publisher wasn't Microsoft. Actually, at the time, it was another big publisher where they had a really weird reaction to like just a mildly negative. It wasn't even a review. It was like a preview that pointed out some failing with the game, and that was the last. But never with Microsoft.
To all of us.
We benefited from it because we got to put a playable game disc on the front cover every month.
Mm-hmm.
So we had huge benefits and advantages. But as a result of that process, it took longer to make the magazine than it would a traditional one. Mm-hmm. And so we weren't always scooping people, right? And I remember we did a preview of Brute Force, and like I wrote the headline for this, but people still stopped me in E3 and like attacked me about it. Like, you said Brute Force was going to be a Halo killer. How ironic. And I'm like, yeah, but like if we had been on, Die Hard Game Fan or any other magazine, we'd have written the exact same headline because we wanted you to open it and read it and decide, this is BS. It's not a Halo killer, right? Great, you had all the tools you needed to, yeah. So, but yeah, it's funny how folks think about those times that it seems distant to me now, but I always, it's like when you're an adult, you feel like you're a kid for much longer than you really are. Yeah. And I felt like I was a game journalist for longer than I really was as well. And now, like I'd be out of my league now. Like, we were, before we started this, we were talking about like famous game journalists, and they're just the reporting that's going on now, just because there's so much more information and access and stuff. It's just better. They just have more stuff, mm-hmm. and the media that they can apply to a story, apart from like proper high grade photography, but the fact that you can show a 20-minute movie of a game now instead of just writing reams and reams of impressions just completely changes things up. And serious reporting, like the Jason Schreiers of this world, like, reporting on real things. And that was
Human
what Next
stories,
Gen
yeah.
did back in the day, and Edge at Future Publishing. They were sister magazines, obviously.
Yep. And then at the end of 2004, everything changed for you. You became writer and community manager at Bungie on the Halo franchise. How did that happen?
I started in December 2003. I know that because I keep having to put it on a form somewhere, and I can't remember what it is. It happened because I was obviously working with a lot of Xbox folks just on stories. And actually, like if I'd been on Next Gen, I was on the official Xbox magazine, but if I'd been on Next Gen doing the Xbox beat, which I was actually, I keep having to remind myself, I'd have had the same kind of context. But I remember I'd interview from time to time, but also talk with Pete Parsons a lot back in the day. And he was my Svengali. I don't think people use that term anymore. But
yeah.
No, he was just a fun guy, and we just talked even when we weren't working on something. And I kind of liked his. He actually came from a publishing background as well. He worked on similar to mine, but without the tagginess. He worked on like muscle and fitness type magazines, as sort of writer. And Pete is he's pretty beefy dude. Like he could destroy me in an arm wrestling match. But he was they were getting ready they were getting ready to start closing down the production of Halo 2 at this time. This was after Halo 1. They were already huge. And this was kind of before we knew that Xbox Live was going to be a behemoth. Xbox Live, it was announced, I think it was even out. But they didn't have a killer app yet. They had Mech Assault, and I still never got credit for any kills I ever did in Mech Assault. I just got kill skills nonstop. But I killed most of those guys. There weren't rich stats to prove it. But Pete was, as they were going into, and I'm saying Pete, but also Brian Gerard, he was doing the bulk of that work there, but it was just bigger and bigger and bigger. So Brian had to grow his role. And so they needed someone who was just much more focused on writing and sort of day-to-day community. So I was in EIC. I don't think it was a step down, but if you just look at your sort of job role and responsibilities or management tree, it would look like kind of a step down. But it was by this point, all I wanted to do was work on the games. And I love writing about them, but so much was happening in the sort of space of invention and novel, surprising big changes and how games. It took me back to when arcades were a thing again, where I would go into the arcade and every month or two there'd be a real surprise. It might be polygons in hard driving or motion simulations in Space Harrier, whatever it is. There was always something new and amazing. Like I'm old enough that it was like color vector graphics and stuff like that. But I love that the newness of it. So like I'm not an inventor, but I love writing and I love being in the sort of thick of that innovation sort of environment. So they just needed someone to be the community manager, writer, and there were other writing tasks.
Ever community manager in the games industry?
Brian Gerard already was a successful and popular and widely threatened community manager before I was.
That's kind of the badge of success, though, isn't it? How many threats you get?
And and how well you wear them. But there were I think there were a couple, but I think to me Brian Gerard was the sort of gold standard of that. But there was, I think, Blizzard.
Now every franchise has one.
But Blizzard back then, I think, did as well. It maybe wasn't called that then, but I certainly wasn't the first. Not by any.
You're the first one I remember. I'll put it to you that way. Yeah,
I was the first one to be arrested on national TV. But Brian was, to me, he was the kind of model for it, and I took over his kind of old job as he sort of moved into doing more, much more marketing stuff, because Halo had blown up so big that they didn't have a good sort of conduit between the game team and the marketing. There wasn't like a big distraction or a conflict of interest or any of that stuff. So Brian ended up doing more of that. And he was still running the community and web teams as well. And their web team was growing as well. And then there was this amazing thing happened with Halo 2 where the web team and the game team really converged. So I did a little bit of like writing, a combat dialogue, and it was all hands on deck for
You
that.
actually worked on the game. Yeah.
A little bit. I mean,
Yeah.
I could find it. Nobody else could.
Yeah.
But I
Did you
did
get a
the
credit?
yeah. If you're working on the game, you're working on the game, and that's pretty standard now. But
Oh, there's lots of people who get left out of credits who work on games for sure.
you have to have like a really alphabetically striking name, like Aaron Aardvark or something like that, and you can find out quicker at least.
Yeah.
I worked on the. Pete actually had an idea. I don't remember how much of it was forming in his head, but he's like, we got to do something big with the manual for this game, because back in the day, you used to get instructions on how to do a thing in the box. And our manuals back then were, they were part of the collection experience, right? They were glossy, like games it'd be mentioned in every review, for better or worse. If it was
the instruction manual. Yeah.
So we did Halo 2. We had a couple of versions. We had like the steel box, like collectible thing. Steel box is a real word. I always misappropriate, but we had a metal box. And there was a regular edition. And so Pete wanted to do something special with the manual. And either he suggested it, or I suggested it, or I riffed off of something that he had said. And because we had 2 editions, like I'm an extremely sophisticated thinker, I like, we should have 2 manuals and they should both be different, right? And we decided to do one manual from the UNSC perspective, which was kind of how Halo presents this fiction, like everything's from the sort of space marine perspective. And one from the Covenant perspective. And so I did that. So you're still writing a real instruction manual, but then just phrasing the same instructions in, and it's easy when it's like the story intro, right? Because you're like, okay, now you do it in like angry space monster tone.
Right.
But we tried to make them sympathetic as well, because of a twist that happens in the game later. That takes a long time, so I don't know how much of it was work versus how much it was just duration. But it was it did feel special, and we actually got plaudits for that. Somebody reviewed it and did I think it was Slate or someone like that, and they talked about the politics of it being kind of nuts. That was fun, and then that was an example to me, because I'm still a new employee at this point. It was an example of how different things were, just because the scale of Halo, but also because that web team and that community team was now directly involved in game features. So there's so many folks there doing amazing stuff that is fundamental to how you think about Halo gameplay, but also multiplayer all up. So there was folks like Max Hoberman, Damian Isla, Rog, too many folks to name. Tom and Roger, especially on how the web stats would then interface with the game stats. But most of that stuff was coming from Max Hoberman and his team. Max wanted to use the population to make the game better, to make matchmaking faster. He also wanted to use the skill ranking system that they were working on to make it so that each game was a nail biter. Because LAN games with Halo were huge, and you thought about them like you were watching the sort of NFL Sunday rosters, like, oh my God, the Patriots are going to stomp on whoever, the Browns typically. But
I'm a Steelers fan, so I'm glad that when you were looking for a bad team, the first team that came to your mind was the Cleveland Browns.
I went to the one I had the most sympathy for. But Max wanted it to be, because the stories that you tell about your gameplay experience are in those lands, because you'd be driving across town with 5 CRTs and 5 Xboxes and miles of cabling to do this. There's so much effort involved that your stories from those gameplay experiences were only ever about the close or crazy games. And he wanted to take that aspect, and I think he called it like the virtual couch. And he wanted it to be so that we had gone into a LAN and set the best teams up against the best teams based on the qualifications of even individual players. Like, it's not always perfect. And we were lucky that Halo was guaranteed a huge audience and a huge Xbox Live participation. So it worked. But he set up a bunch of systems for matchmaking, skill ranking, progress, achievements, and so on and so on and so on, that probably existed in loads of other games, but I had never seen them all put in one place. And it's certainly not in broadband on a console.
Right.
And I remember, we went to the opening event for Halo 2 in downtown Redmond, and we were there, signing things and handing out pizza, whatever we were doing. But everyone wanted to get back because we didn't know if it was going to work, right? Because
You're just
we
sitting
turn
there
all the servers
freaking
on
out.
as like, is this going to work? And we couldn't test at the scale we do now.
Yeah.
It was just impossible. And Max, of course, was right. And I keep saying,
Because it was brand new.
anytime
It was
I name a
bleeding edge
single
at
person,
the time.
yeah. And it was brilliant. And I remember that one in particular, Max's input always stuck out to me, because it was a great example of a thing in video games that is really hard to codify, which is a designer has an idea and it is a thing that can't adequately be described. You can look at, Max documents everything, so you could actually look at it on paper and see how sort of elaborate and brilliant it all was, but you couldn't know if it was a good idea or not until it was really out there in the field, which is one of the great things about right now is you can beta test things and you can do all this stuff, and really sort of test things out in the field in a way that you couldn't back in the day.
But now you just have to sweat about leaks,
right?
Somebody uploading an hour of Halo Infinite to YouTube, and
or an hour of Halo 4 multiplayer on set in a barn to Cotton Eye Joe music, apparently by Tom Morello, was one of my favorite leaks. And it was such a ridiculous leak. This is a fuzzy YouTube. You can probably find it with those search terms. It was such a ridiculous leak that people thought it wasn't real.
Right.
But it's completely real. But yeah, that night at launch, it was way past midnight, like 2 a.m. People still lining up to get their game at GameStop. We just wanted to get back to make sure all the lights were on and the thing was functioning, and not knowing if it was fun, right, which is a huge part of it.
Absolutely. What, if anything, about being a journalist helped or hurt you when you moved over to development?
I think I moved over to development at the right time to be useful, because again, the idea of an extended community, the idea of the sort of borders between being a dev and being the community, and of course being a journalist, that's actually an interface between community and game dev. So I think if I had done this today, I just wouldn't be qualified, right?
Mm-hmm.
It would be a really different a different set of skills that was needed. And
we seems to be happening a good bit, though. Seems like still a lot of community managers end up moving over to the development side,
right? And but I think that job is sort of settled now. It's settled law. Like people know what they're doing. I think even being a print and web journalist was a pretty different skill. It wasn't just writing. The folks that really took off, I think, like if we all had a crystal ball, then being able to do that and become a YouTuber, right? That just own your whole trajectory and actually make money doing it, and you've got lots of big success stories there. But again, a lot of the big YouTubers weren't necessarily popular in the traditional gaming. There certainly were examples like Giant Bomb and stuff where it was like gaming blew up big and had their own thing. But there are plenty of just fresh faces in that YouTube scene where they can show you the game, talk about it, play it with you, experience it all, and just kind of do that sort of soup to nuts experience. But mine was about being an interface between fans and the game in a very literal sense because of Xbox Live and online gaming. And like I definitely, when I first started at Bungie, was like a test mule for ideas, whether or not I was smart or not. But people would run things by me because they felt like I was connected to some part of it that they weren't. But my main skill was writing, typing, and I was lucky because I get to sort of segue that into storytelling proper. And again, writing that manual was it's not exactly a novel, but it was obviously directly related to what that is. So.
Okay, and then in mid 2008, you sort of had your day of career reckoning. You're basically, you had to decide whether to stay at Bungie, the studio that kind of given you your start and you had grown up in, or move along with the Halo franchise to 343 Industries. What was that decision like, and how did you ultimately come to a decision?
It was really tough, and it's not necessarily very visible in the the sort of online sphere as you're tracking it. So I might tell you something here that's a new detail, but I actually did move with Bungie. The Brian Gerard and I we were involved quite early in the spin out discussions. Again, through that sort of interface between, between PR and marketing, the game team proper, the fans, and so on. So we were there to help with how do we communicate this to the team? Like, how do we get feedback? How do we, because it wasn't necessarily just some star chamber saying we're taking the company off. Like they needed the whole studio to go along. There's a lot of things I just probably could talk about, but not 100% sure when that's safe or not. But it was we were involved in it way earlier than I think a bulk of people knew. There was a lot of discussion about it and a lot of rumbling, but when it really started to take shape, it got very serious. And I think one of the things that, and I know that Bungie didn't communicate this at all, but I think one of the things that came from being passive about communication in that period is there was a lot of, why did this happen and whose idea was it, and who's divorcing who. And I think that there was Microsoft was seen as a villain for a few of those, but from our perspective, like Microsoft was 100% enabling this, and once the topic was broached, Microsoft had to go along with it because Microsoft owned the IP and the studio building and the everything. So right. It was it had to be an agreement. Sorry, I'm hanging up on a call, even though this has got call blocking. Microsoft had to go along with this, right? And I'm sure some people had a smaller appetite for this than others, but I think there were a lot of people at Microsoft said, we got such an amazing thing out of Bungie and Xbox Live all up and everything, that we have to be serious about their desire to go take this back to their, a lot of it was about going back to our roots. Like, right. We're too big now. Like, have we lost anything in that? And it was about, shrinking in a sense, even though the studio got bigger and bigger every day. I, by this point, was just enamored by Halo. Like, that was my job. I loved it. I loved every single thing about it. But the studio wanted to kind of go away, do something original. I think Microsoft probably would have come around to letting them. In fact, there was one thing which Microsoft's forcing them to make Halo games. Well, that actually wasn't true. Like, Bungie could have made what Destiny was going to be with Microsoft as well. It just would have been, they just wouldn't have been in control of their own destiny. It's not a coincidence the game is called that. That's a word that was being batted around a lot. But the game at the time when I made that decision was very different. It was it was much more RPG, less action, and way less sci-fi. It initially started as kind of a sort of myths and monsters, Dungeons and Dragons atmosphere with some really things that are very apparent in the game that they shipped. Like, I recognize it, but if you'd seen some of those original documents about what it was going to be, where it's like Bard and Soothsayer and Dragon might have been appropriate.
So it was more of a fantasy game at first.
It was heading in that direction in a way, but again, it was about game systems and community, and again, the things that Destiny really is. And also about, I think, probably trying to create a shift in tone from Halo, so it didn't look like you were doing another Halo. But it was really the gameplay systems that were, and lore. Like, I know it sounds strange to say that it wasn't that lore, it's this lore, but Bungie is really about building sort of layered, sort of mysterious and deep and eventually rich lore as you sort of dig through it. But I wasn't that story. It wasn't that I wasn't interested in that story. I was just really interested in where Halo was going, because we'd just done Reach. I mean, saying we'd done Reach, we're still shipping Reach. And I'd gotten to write the first draft of the screenplay for Reach. And so I was super invested in those characters in that world. And I had done a lot of setup for things I wanted to see in the Return of Master Chief sort of stuff.
Yep.
And did things like that in the Halo 3 terminals. And there was a lot of setup that we'd set up, and I wanted to see it to some sort of conclusion. So we left Microsoft, we spun out as our own company, and I was a Bungie LLC employee for I can't remember, but like 2 or 3 months. In fact, I had to when I did finally go back to Microsoft, I had to like arrange so that I had uninterrupted tenure at Microsoft. It was like by this time I knew that, and we obviously had to work out with Pete Parsons and all those guys. But it was largely because I would have gone and stayed with Bungie, and that was where my sort of loyalty was in terms of the company. But Bonnie Ross, who I'd worked with a bunch over the years, and Kiki Wolf and Dave Berger, a bunch of people that are still there in the leadership team. I was part of the team responsible for handing off the keys to the kingdom. So the story Bible, bits of story thread that we had. And Bonnie wasn't saying, "Give me all the stuff. We're going to go away and make it." She's like, "Well, what were you guys going to do?" Like, well, it was really important to her that whatever they did was a continuation of what was organic and natural for it. And that was the thing that I was drawn to. It was like, oh wow, this person actually cares. And like, if you know Bonnie Ross, like you would always kind of know that, but it was really apparent because she thought I was gone and was trying to get the best of Bungie, not just code or engine components, but like the spirit of the thing. Right. And so I ended up doing little bits of what I ended up doing as a full-time job while I was in that handoff period. And then eventually someone who's not there anymore said, would you even consider coming back? And I think I said no on the spot but then I went away and thought about it. And I think my wife talked me into it. She's like, well, you really like Halo, and you said you didn't care about this one. Like I'd be talking about a specific character or thread or something like that. She's like, that's not your thing. And I said, but it is because I really like Gene Wolfe. And
right.
And it was just realizing that they were serious about it and that they were going to take the time to build it and do it justice was what made me decide to stay with Microsoft. So, but I didn't really stay at Microsoft. Kind of jump back.
So technically you didn't, but
and of course the hardest part was all these folks that my friends and my best friends were there, and it was just really tough. And it was a little bit of there's still like, even now there's still like a little bit of like intramural, you guys are the bad guys. I'm like, no, remember we just said that because we were trying to make marketing seem like the villain all the time. but yeah, so and of course I still see those guys, so then hang out with them all the time. So there is no real schism in that sense. But it was very ideal for me. But again, I think I was just in the right place at the right time. I don't think any other month even would have had me commit to that decision.
And so you went to 343 Industries. You're now the franchise creative director for Halo at 343.
Yep.
What exactly does that mean, Frank?
Today it means this interview. But I run the franchise team. Like, we're tasked with making the franchise function throughout game, media, toys, board games, jigsaw puzzle, like that sort of like. There's
That's
tedious
a fun job you've got there, buddy.
Some of it is. Some of it is just nightmarish, like cease and desists, and
right.
You'd be amazed how many people use our IP without our permission.
Yeah.
And so some of it's that tedious stuff, but I think the exciting stuff I get to do is like help craft the next stories and help craft the overall arc of the universe. If you think about it, like I hate saying this, it's like the MCU, it only like much smaller scale, and we haven't done all of those things yet, but our universe is built to be that way, to be extensible across different, not just different projects, but different avenues of story. And that was always my big challenge: is can we tell a story about ODSTs? Can we tell a story about the fall of Reach that doesn't have Master Chief in it, and so on? So right now, working on a little bit of game stuff as we're getting close to ship. There's a bunch of sort of content that still needs to be done, and the TV show with Showtime. That is, we got paused for COVID like everyone else. Production shut down. Production started up again at the start of the year, but slowed down through COVID. That is a huge time outside of the FPS, which is always our number one priority. The biggest single time suck right now is the show, and it's a lot of what we do in the game as well, is providing story and background for things, and there's a lot of but there's also a lot of approvals and like screens and screens and screens of GAC on spaceship monitors that has to be, doesn't always have to do something, usually does. We usually make it do something, but it has to be correct within the confines of reasonable feasibility.
Because the fans are
But
gonna
it's fun.
go through that stuff with a fine
Right.
tooth comb. Yeah,
Right.
you
Well,
know
I mean, I can't talk too much about this show's story, but we're obviously involved in that from start to finish. Kiki
That's good
Wolfkill is
news.
out and she's in Budapest now as EP, being our boots on the ground, along with one of my guys, Kenneth Peters. He's a former Marine, but he's a story lore Bible nerd. And he's out there in the field. And he, like, I think when we designed that task, it was obviously a lot of work. We figured you'll probably be doing like 6 hours of that a day, and you'll only have 2 hours for your regular job, and you'll be online. It's vast. It's the scale of the production is enormous, and so it's nonstop. And he still has to do all that in the rain, or in COVID lockdown in Hungary. But he also, everyone is all hands on deck for the game the whole time as well. So that was I think the hardest part of COVID for us, was those two things overlapping, and even with delays, like that overlap got worse and worse.
Gotcha. What is it like being the conduit for fans for one of the industry's biggest franchises? Because look, there are community managers and sort of middle people between the fans and games for every game, but not every game is Halo. What is it like doing that job?
I kind of look at the way other games handle this stuff. And sometimes we'll do crossovers with like we did a thing with Fortnite recently. That's another, like, our team handles all of those kinds of things. And I watch this scale of those things, because we're a big game, and we're a big AAA game, and we will be an even bigger, like, weirdly, well, it's weird to me because I'm used to this sort of lull on season, big build up to launch of game, and then lull, but it hasn't really been that way. But also because MCC came out in PC, we're actually growing our audience even in the off period. So, but looking at the way that they've handled scale, and the way that they've turned this is Fortnite again, the way that they've turned the game into a kind of a venue for other things that aren't just the game. Roblox does this too. Minecraft does this as well. It had that aspect of this has actually helped me understand games as a different medium, like another shift from when they became sort of online competitive or multiplayer. But also, I finally understand what it is that because my kid has always played these games, and they're ones that I wasn't interested in, like I'm an FPS gamer. So Fortnite was a moment where we kind of connected. And I like tooling around in Minecraft, but I don't go do the Minecraft things. But my kid does. She's 12, and she's always played those games because they were social gel for her and her friends,
creative,
especially COVID. Right. And you add that to COVID, it's become this super valuable place for them to go be with their peers and their friends and their enemies too. But it's still healthy and constructive. Like my kid, when she's staying up past her bedtime, invariably building something, right? And that's arguably more productive than
sleep.
What I would have been done
to admit it, but
with my ColecoVision. Like, I'm just killing Donkey Kong again for the 50th time in a row. Yeah,
that's true. But what is it like, more of the interaction with the fans directly? I think anyone who's ever kind of put themselves out there has had to deal with sort of the online mobs, the vocal minority. How did you kind of train yourself to deal with that whole landscape?
I mean, I don't want to speak for Brian Gerard, but I think Brian and we've been through such a similar sort of time period and experience that it's, we joke about like death threats, and that stuff happens. And I mean, that's just do
you think it's strange that we joke about that? Because as a journalist, I've received death threats.
No, it's not funny.
Do you think it's crazy that we've kind of normalized it to the point where we just joke about it now? We're like, oh, I've had 25 death threats. I've had 1,000.
It's not okay. And there's things I can do. There's things we can do with our games and with our actions that can help make better citizens. I was talking to an audio guy the other day about the ethics of making a multiplayer character say something that the kid didn't want to. Like, kid may have wanted to say something stupid and racist and mean. The multiplayer AI makes him say something useful and helpful, right? So
That's
we do have
awesome.
tools. We have tools, right? We can make people better citizens in a sense.
That would
But
be great.
we knew from the go that there's a difference between a kid in a rage acting out in the heat of the moment and a serious threat that you have to take seriously. I think, but you also have to know how to filter it out. And I get that some people just, nobody should be expected to have to do that. But I think Brian and I have been through the wars long enough to know, firstly, know the difference between real and fake or angry or whatever. But I think the only good thing that comes of those negative experiences is understanding things that we can do to make it easier for folks who are in those trenches now, like for our community team, and they don't have to be exposed to that. I give people, I have to give them sensible advice first and foremost. Like, if you see something scary online, examine it and make sure that you're not making light of something that could be serious. But I also, I'll share my experience. Like 99 times out of 100, they didn't think anything of that. They weren't thinking about you as a person or acting out anything, just how they talk, for example. But I do think that we have a responsibility with kids where things that can be affected or impacted by peer pressure. I'm just talking about the constructive part where you're in road building a house together. That's great. Somebody told me that you can't make someone racist. They're either racist or they're not. I beg to differ. You can make a teenager. You can make a teenager a racist in 2 minutes of peer pressure from his friends. Like, whether or not he really is a racist, but if his cool racist friend says something racist and gets a reaction, that's all it takes. So we have a responsibility to try and deal with that sort of online negativity with whatever tools we can provide, or whatever. Sometimes it's just going to be imperatives or impetus to make people behave better for good reasons for them. It might be selfish. My real experience, though, after 20 years of, I'm going on for 17 years of working on Halo, my real experience is that the vast majority of our community are constructive, great, awesome, creative people. And that's how I think you get to carry the burden of the odd serious negative thing. But again, I'm lucky. Like, I'm a white middle-aged man, and the level of invective that gets thrown at people of color, women, anyone who's different than somebody else, and it doesn't always have to be that sort of white privilege. There are plenty of like inversions of that can happen, but nobody should have to go through that. And we try and do what we can to make our games a safe, well-lighted place for everyone, including our studio, so that the people working there feel safe. And I see things online happening to other studios and other people that I just, you can relate, but you just wish that wasn't the sort of spastic reaction of certain types of folk.
Social media certainly
easier
helps
tools to just
engender that behavior as well.
Yeah,
the immediacy
absolutely.
of it and the access. I mean,
yeah.
Back when we started in the industry, you couldn't reach out to someone like you
Right.
unless you had your phone number or your email address. There was no way.
Which they did get sometimes.
Yeah.
So,
the really crafty ones. Yep.
Yeah.
I definitely got a few calls from the switchboard at MTV for people looking for me after I wrote a review that people didn't agree with. So there are people who, and those are the ones you got to look out for. The people who go that far, that's when the red flags need to go up, I believe.
Yeah. The negative, it's like a poop in a swimming pool, right? It's a tiny fleeting percentage of the volume of water, but you can't. Now the whole pool looks like that. You're like, I'm not going in the pool until they get that. And it may be a payday. In fact, that's the other thing. It is always a payday bar, right? And you scoop it out and the water's perfectly fine. But it's scooping it out and noticing it is important. And we, as parents, as developers, as publishers, like we aren't responsible for it, but we have to be responsible for it. And that's, an amazing amount of work in this industry goes towards that, towards trying to make places better and make people better. without warping their behaviors or beliefs. Like, give them tools to be better is the way to go about it.
Who ultimately decides what will or will not appear in any given Halo game? Is that your job?
I mean, it can be.
Yeah.
I mean, if something shows up in our game, and it has done from time to time, where I mean, I've never vetoed anything that other people didn't agree with. First, like I never get to do this as wholly subjective level. I could, but I try to work with our narrative and writer team early on, so that everyone knows what we're building. Like, and if somebody, puts in something, if somebody puts in something offensive by accident, that just gets taken out as part of what we call GOps, where we just check the game for, that flag upside down is super rude in one country, that sort of stuff.
Right.
But for story stuff, we have some weird things with Halo specifically, like Cortana becoming more and more sexualized through fidelity, but not anything else. Like, just the higher resolution you made Cortana, the odder that original sprite, highly polygonal, like very primitive sprite, like the more organic she becomes, the weirder it becomes. So we have to tune those sorts of things. Those are kinds of things.
He's also just an AI.
Yeah, right. But those are the like controversial things. They shouldn't be controversial at all, but they can be. Storytelling, we map that out so early in the process that where you really get to friction is when execution happens and the odd line of dialogue comes off feeling like really wrong, or they put the wrong emphasis on the wrong syllable, right? And
right.
But ultimately, could be, like, weirdly, I think Bonnie obviously would have, ultimate veto power, but she trusts creative people to make creative decisions. Theoretically, Phil Spencer could, but I've never once seen Phil interject in a game before shipping, like in that sort of creative sense. He comes to playtest and stuff, and he might say that, can't you make the pistol have the same
tighten up the
reload time
graphics
as
on
it used
level
to?
4.
Yeah, but that's the other thing. Phil knows game development, right? So
And he knows
we
games
don't
really
have
well.
and we don't have any executives who are this sort of Hollywood joke of an executive, right? So it's such a collaborative process that there isn't any one. I do feel guilty sometimes where we're like the franchise police, because it's some tedious granular thing, like, no, they would never salute like that because they're Marines, that sort of thing. But for the big ticket stuff, it's a collaboration, so everyone can object. And we've had team members say, hey, that's actually pretty insensitive and we just didn't know. And you're like, oh yeah, man, you're right, that flag is upside down.
Gotcha.
So there's no single figure who does that. Joe Staten right now, because he's EPing out the door and has worked on Halo Creative for so long, he'll absolutely be doing the sort of balls and strikes of that right now. But a large team gets to make those decisions, and that same large team then has to be happy with them and the end result. So, and responsible for it.
How would you characterize the reception of the new Halo games from 343 versus the reception that the Bungie games got?
Yeah, I think this is probably true of any sort of shift in creator, or apparent shift in creator. Because I was there, spanning across those things, and sometimes making decisions on the same things that then were criticized as that's a 343 thing and that's a Bungie thing. I know that a lot of that is, purely, it's categorization, subjective categorization. Right. Some of it is real, of course, because when you shift a team that radically, you're going to see differences in creative output and vision. But the engine, until Infinite, was very, very similar. Like, we got more fidelity out of it by the end in Halo 4 and 5, but there were a lot of numbers in there that were the same. So you'd hear people complaining about certain sort of physics things. The physics, reload speeds, aim assist, all that stuff was never the same between any game. So if you're going to get to the 343 is worse than, or Bungie is worse than on some specific thing, you better do your homework, because a lot of times people will complain about things that haven't changed or were made by the same guy, or But also the Halo team, the Halo 2 team was way larger than the Halo 1 team, with all new people doing all new things. And Halo 3 larger still. And so there's a sort of population Venn diagram thing of moving around that makes those kind of I think it's kind of an artifice. Better to compare Halo 1, 2, 3, and Reach to Destiny, right? Because then at least you can follow that thread
that
logically.
Arc, yeah.
But yeah, we get the good and bad of that. There's a multiplayer is always the most contentious. I remember the biggest single moment like the one you're describing is Halo2sucks.com, which was a real website that came out shortly after Halo 2 ruined Halo, while going on to be the biggest Halo. So you can't make the people happy all the time. You can't make all of them happy ever. So you kind of have to pick your balance. The other thing is, like, if you follow, there's a certain thread, and it's not just true of Halo, it's true of sort of nostalgia and classicism in games. And I had this myself for loads of things, even Halo things. I'm like, no, I prefer the Halo 1 Magnum. Why can't we have that? And the Halo 2 this, and the Halo 4 that, and so on. But the number one vector for those arguments and comparisons and conversations is it's multiplayer, for one thing, because that's where the repetitions and sort of fine grain are coming down. But if you actually follow that thread to its logical conclusion with you just, what are the biggest complaints, follow that to some final conclusion. And not Halo necessarily, like, let's say it's Street Fighter. In fact, Street Fighter is a great example because they have so many variants and they do such sort of fine tuning. You end up with, and there may be one single game, but usually that's not true either. But you might end up with somebody saying, I want it to have the same exact gameplay as Street Fighter Alpha. But okay, so we'll do that, but we'll make the graphics better. No, they need to be the exact same graphics, just higher resolution and higher frame rate. Well, if we up the resolution, the frame rate, we have to make slight change. No. And so if you follow that, there's no single person believes that, obviously it's insane. But if you do follow that average, you sometimes end up with, so you want us to ship the exact same game, the exact same, with no differences, because the differences that are purely aesthetic impact the sort of objective measures of how the thing must feel or play or look or whatever it is. So you have to innovate too, and that's got to be the biggest pressure for anyone making sequels. Like movies, okay, it needs to be as good as the first thing, but it needs to have all this new technology and be better as well. And that that's our job, right? That's everyone's job in gaming, especially if they're making sequels, is to continually make things better and continually invent new things and new ways to do things. You don't change anything for the sake of change. Like, I see that criticism leveled at a lot of games. That's never true. Actually, I can think of 2 times that I've seen that in the industry, let alone our game. It's never true. And it's sometimes people want to come in and put their own stamp on things, but it's rarely as simple as even that. It's if things are changed, there's usually an excellent reason for it, and change is I think the toughest thing to contend with in any multiplayer experience. And people see that not just between game sequels, but between monthly updates and tuning passes and so on. So you have to just do your best, and if it works, people will continue to engage in it, and if it doesn't, they will stop, right? And that's our job.
Do you think 343's games have been treated fairly by fans and the press?
We just talked about the artifice of, like, labeling a thing Bungie and labeling a thing 343. Like, it's an artifice for me to argue for or against that as well, because then I'm guilty of doing the exact same thing. So fairly is, what did people like? What didn't they like?
Do you feel like the two sets of games are judged by the same standards? Keeping in mind, obviously, this time technology evolves, and
I think they can't be, because because then those things are real. So technology difference is real. Trends are real. Nostalgia is real.
Oh yeah,
and so on. You ultimately, you judge a game's success by its success, right? If we one day in 1,000 years ended up with a completely different audience with not a single person left, that would suck to me, right? Because you'd want to bring people along for the ride, even if it was bigger in 1,000 years.
You'd feel like you had failed in some way if that were the case. Would you feel that way?
I would, but that wouldn't necessarily be true. But
Right.
for
Because it keeps
the way that I
selling more
approach
than it
my
ever
job,
has.
yeah,
And yeah.
part of my job is trying to satisfy the outcomes of things that people have been thinking about for a long time. Not necessarily gameplay at all, but like storylines, character
Yeah.
development, those kinds of things. My job is to satisfy as many folks waiting for an outcome as possible. Um, and I think that's actually true of everyone's discipline, right? So if somebody came to 343 from another game, they'd want to make a better version of the thing that they do in this game, not
Yeah,
change
sure.
it necessarily, but have it be better. So
Mhm.
everyone's approaching it with that same intent, and you absolutely are going to get nostalgia goggles, but you're also going to get like you'll get rewarded for innovation when it's successful. You know, we will make changes in Infinite that people will do what they do with every iteration of the game, and sometimes they're right, sometimes it is nostalgia where no, it should go back to how it was in that. That always happens, and that's why I use that Halo 2 sucks thing, because it sounds like a really long time ago. That was the most radical changes we ever made to any Halo game. Dual wielding, all the timing was different, every single weapon behaved
Yeah.
differently. Like in terms of just a shopping list of things that are true Halo and changes we made, Halo 2 in some ways was arguably the most innovative one we ever made, because it really shook up the that's one of those reasons we were so nervous at midnight. And of course
Yeah.
we did get home at 4 a.m. and find out that not everyone was happy. But I think that's where Brian and I started to get tougher skin about that sort of thing.
You're
But
never
you
going to please
can't,
everyone. That was probably your
right,
moment where you realized truly there's no way you're
yeah,
going to please
but
everyone.
you also can't use that as armor to evade
Yeah.
your responsibility, right? You have to
Yep.
listen, and you have to hear the intention and the accuracy against with criticism as well as praise. Like you have to hear it, and you have to,
Yeah.
maybe you won't ever go back and change that thing, but at least understand what they were saying, at least
Yep.
understand why they were mad.
Yep.
Again, you can't make everyone happy and succeed, but you could listen and understand what you could do better. So,
That's the
and
right
if you're changing
perspective.
something, try and make the new thing better. Like maybe they won't come around to it, but maybe it is better. So
Yep. That's a good point.
yeah,
What is it like guarding something like Master Chief's face for so long? I
yeah,
would liken it to maybe being like the manager of Kiss in the
yeah,
70s when they wore the makeup and they wouldn't be photographed without the
yeah.
makeup. He was described in detail in the Fall of Reach novel. So why
Right.
have you guys not shown him?
It's super weird, right? Like he's absolutely an avatar for the player's persona.
Uh-huh.
Right? You're the player. You are Shane. Shane is running through these corridors. When you talk about what you did last night, you don't talk about he or there's this cool moment where Master Chief shot 15 grunts. Well, no, it's like you did it.
Yeah.
So that's super satisfying. We're not the only game that does that. We're one of the games that makes like kind of a thing about it, but it's almost a joke with the double helmet reveal if you
Yeah.
stick past the credits. But it's important to the game, but it's super important to if my 12-year-old girl, my daughter, is playing Halo, I want her to say, I did this, I shot 14 grunts.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't want to yank that away from them. But by the same token, we are telling a real story with a meaningful narrative. And the narrative, it's just this biography. He's like a pale skinned, giant white guy. It's kind of irrelevant. Like he'd still be, if he was 6'1" instead of 6'5", if he was African American instead of white, if he was left-handed instead of right-handed. He's actually ambidextrous, obviously. He's superhuman.
Yeah.
It wouldn't make any difference. Like those aren't biographical aspects of his character or behavior. His character and behavior. Well, there is of it in the games, which is quite light because he's just winning all the time, right? But in the books, he has much more character. He's a leader. He cares about his team. There's lots going on. His background is super tragic. Like his backstory is one of the darkest in games. It's all meaningful to how he turned out the way he is. Like at some point, Master Chief made a decision where he knew what his background was. Like he realized all this horror and tragedy that he came from, but he decided that his job was to do the right thing anyway. Like that's the strongest he ever is when like, oh my God, I was kidnapped. This cruel, awful, illegal, tragedy that's happened to me, and I still love my family and my unit and my comrades and my species and my planet, and I'm still going to do the right thing to save them. So it ends up being it's funny to see the specifics that people get mad about, but also not surprising since we make that a satisfying part of playing the game, so that you're not constantly yanked out of the experience and reminded that you are not Kratos, you're not Batman or whatever it is. You are, you know, you can be Shane and make it to the end of the game and feel like you're the hero. So it's a huge part of gaming. It's one of, when we talk to the TV folks or the movie folks, it's one of the biggest differences. Like there's a lot of things that will happen in the game that are super satisfying that are not dramatically satisfying. That goes both ways. So you're going to have a hard time translating this game thing to the screen, and we can't treat the screen like it's a video game either. So there has to be a real marriage of the benefits of each format. Same with novels and comic books and so on. But that's a challenge that I think game adaptations have had, and where they've been successful is like, is it a good premise? Yes. Tomb Raider, did the first one work? Yes. Why? Because it was a good premise. It's like, female Indiana Jones with a decent story and a decent like mystery and whatever. Like that's the trick. But not all games can do that. Like Mortal Kombat has a harder time with that because the setup of that thing interferes with the drama in some ways, or interferes with like the 3 act structure and so on. So you just have to look at the strengths of each media and figure out, do I take this one-to-one and put it on the screen, or do I translate it into something that has a similar effect but uses the strength of the opposing media? So
do you think, because look, you're right, in the books, the novels, there are shades to Master Chief, but then I feel like when we play the games, it's culled, it's pulled back. You look at franchises like some of the ones you mentioned, or like The Last of Us Part 2. Like I would struggle to think that franchise would be as successful if they had taken that approach with its main characters. Do you fear that not sort of providing more nuance to your lead character in the franchise could be a detriment to it eventually?
I think it depends. It's going to sound hyper simplistic. Depends on the genre. Like I think if we were a third person game, we'd already have dealt with those things, right? I think that we, as soon as you take away the value of being I think as soon as you take away the value of being of a vessel, like of controlling your avatar in the world, you have to do something else to replace that value, right? So in an FPS, the value is an adventure that I am on. The value is the power, the sort of power fantasy and the empowerment I feel. Like sometimes we'll talk to kids with pretty profound disabilities, and it's going to sound dumb, they like running around, right? Not just in Halo, but in any game. It's like an empowerment. It lets them do something that they want to do. That might be leaping a 50-foot chasm and shooting a scorpion with a rocket launcher. You have to balance whatever it is you're removing with something that's equally satisfying. And with characters, that ends up being, that can be biographical, it could be character development. But I think that the genre in this case is super important. I think VR games are dealing with that in a very, very literal way, but it's a similar challenge. So even if, we sometimes pull away to the third person, but not for long, because that is not what people want to do. They do want to reward, right? It's a little bit like RPGs where, the very first RPGs, the games weren't terribly sophisticated, but they were sort of fun and addictive. But your reward was a big cinematic, right? And then as the games get more complicated, that becomes less of the drive and the game becomes more of the drive. With FPS games, it's always been the game. Little bit of reward, pause to wipe the sweat off your brow and move ahead.
Okay. Without explaining why it was delayed, I just would hope that maybe you would share a little bit what it was like when you realized that Halo Infinite was not going to make the launch of Xbox Series consoles.
I'll answer that question in a sneaky and despicable way by saying I obviously can't talk about our development process. I mean, anyone who's worked in development knows the basic outlines of those things. COVID made things really complicated, right? Okay. I am reminded of when I first started on Halo 2 in 2003. I got there, everything's tickety-boo, making the most wildly ambitious game ever. It's going to be multiplayer, Xbox Live. then a few months later, I get called in a big meeting. I'd been given a little bit of a sneak peek that this was happening by Pete and Brian, and they gathered the whole team on the I think we're on the third floor at Millennium E in Redmond, and gathered everyone. Said, "Hey, we bit off more than we could chew. We not only have to drastically inhale the scope of the game that we're going to deliver, although weirdly, mostly like in terms of like content rather than innovation, which was kind of a relief, and that's one of the ways you sell the team in it. So all the work that you've done on this stuff, scrap it. We can cover that material in a sequel, or we can use this elsewhere, and we're going to delay, right? And and I think at one point it was going to be the killer app for the launch of Xbox Live. We had to get confidence from the organization and the company that it will be the killer app for Xbox Live, and you need to give us the time to make it that. And you've got a bunch of other content, and you can keep people happy until that point, and this will give them also something to look forward to on that. I think that there's elements of all of that in where we are now, but that was a big that was eye-opening to me because again, I wasn't a developer.
Right.
I was just learning this trade and seeing, even to this day, like the sacrifices that people had put in to get to that stage, and then the faces that you could maybe just identify by their pallor of where they knew their thing was going to be chopped, delayed, radically altered. Yeah. Everyone's invested in all of it. So that sort of stuff is, and that was a very different situation because it was just too big. Ours was, it was less about us being overambitious and more about us wanting to make what we had the best it could possibly be, and that's where we're headed.
What is it really like developing games during a pandemic? Because we don't, like, a lot of publishers won't share why so many games have been delayed over the last year. The ones that do will a lot of times say it's the pandemic. What's it really like, though?
It definitely depends on your discipline and your persona. I think that, I talk to, there's folks on my team, oh my God, they love working at home, right? And there was an initial ramp to get people up to productivity, and they were even like doing metrics, or individual groups were doing their own metrics, like, oh, you're 70% efficient, blah, blah, blah. There are people who love it, and there are people who hate it and want to be there. They're like, every time I go back into the office, I have to fill out a form and put my mask on and go there. And obviously the building is, there's hybrid work is going to start and all that stuff. But there's always someone in there, because there's some people who just need to go in there to feel connected to it. So, they fill out the form and they wear the mask and they go, get organize their desk or but there's also folks that have to be in that building. There are technical folks, some are music folks. They just have to be there with their equipment.
They need the gear.
So you make it safe, you make it comfortable, and you make it efficient in that order, right? Like, because then people are happy if you do it in that order as well. And we've got our systems down to a fine art. Meetings, weirdly, a little bit more efficient, because we know
that works.
Like, if you're in a Zoom or a Teams meeting, like, you got to have an outcome. So people are, they're tracking stuff, and they're cutting and pasting stuff from the chat. They're like, they're more efficient. You're never late to your next meeting because you were walking from that. That, and I think that's like 40 minutes a day. Like, in my
the
case,
transportation. It's funny when it
so
all adds up.
It depends on your, like, I'm happy in either of those environments as long as we're engaged. That's the main thing for me. But it has made things different, and there was definitely an initial ramp up that, even if we had been on schedule to ship exactly then, probably would have bumped us for a month while we figured out our stuff. But there are some gains in efficiency, and there's some losses. But I think it will mostly be a post-mortem process where not Microsoft or 343, but the world looks and says, what was good about that, and what can we take from that? What can we improve from that, and so on. There's already people, they're folks are recruiting differently, and and someone will do that. But anecdotally, I could go either way, to be honest. Okay. I've got folks on my team love it, and are living their best life in their underpants, and folks who just they just want to get back in and
they're going crazy,
arguing about creative, or
a lot of it might
these
be
sort
their
of
situations at home. If
right,
they're single
right.
and they're living alone, they may
Yeah.
have had it in the
If
first few
they're
months.
as unpopular with their family as I am with mine, then there's a tension. Yeah.
What is the best day you've ever had working on the Halo franchise? What's that one day where you were just so overcome with joy and happiness working on Halo?
I mean, just to go back to, we talked about a lot of the negatives with fans.
Yeah, that's why I wanted to bring this up. Yeah.
Yeah, if I had to pick one, any of our launch events, the New York City one for Halo 3, the Redmond one, much smaller scale, driving around in a bus with pizza. You didn't know you could get pizza delivered to a bus. Actually, in Seattle, they'll deliver pizza to a boat. So if you have like a little speedboat, they will just tell them where you're going to be. They'll bring it.
That's awesome.
But it's always been big fan events, and I think even though I should be all like miserable and cynical and jaded, the big series of live events we did last year, a year and a half ago, like the before times, with the traveling Halo event, Outpost Discovery, like just completely revived my love for our fans who I already loved.
That's great.
But you're just out there and you're like meeting multi-generational fans. Like, here's a kid, and it's like, I'm his dad, and
now
I'm
he's
his
kicking my butt in multiplayer.
Like, they're telling you stories that don't make sense chronologically. You're like, are you a time traveler? And you're like, you're just old. But yeah, it's the Outpost Discovery, and I couldn't actually I keep mixing up memories between cities like Philadelphia. Wait, was that Chicago? And kind of because it's like it's a wash in the best sense, because it's like
big blur when you go on one of those tours. Yeah.
And our fans, like, of course there's a little bit of selection bias, because kind of people who would pay money to come and see Halo stuff or play a VR game with Halo or meet developers. But that's your biggest critics are often your most engaged fans, which again is why you have to listen to them, because they actually do know what they're talking about. And you might disagree with them, or you might agree with them, and maybe you just need to hear what they have to say. But those, plenty of critics at those events, but passionate, informed, engaged critics are just as awesome as passionate, informed, engaged fans. And I love that. Like, you go there to learn, you go there to just meet people and see that this thing that you do has had an effect on their lives. Like, we meet people who got married through Halo all the time. Like, not every day, but every time we go to one of these sorts of events, you meet people and their stories. Yeah, we met each other playing Halo and we got married.
That's awesome. Yep.
Yeah. Teabagging has created a lot of romance.
That's hilarious. Before we let you go, every guest on 3-Night Weekend, we ask them one question. What are you playing? What are you watching? And what are you drinking this weekend?
Okay, so I have, we were talking about TVs before we started up, right?
Yep.
I have a ColecoVision, like the 8-bit console, and it's been in my house for years. I bought it like a yard sale. I'm like, oh, great. One day I'll get an analog tuner and make this work somehow. And I have a newish Sony XBR TV, and I was going to go and research how to do, you need to, like, there's a lot of ways you can do it. You can like buy a VCR, plug the ColecoVision in the VCR, make it one of the channels on the VCR, and have the VCR go to composite, or if you got a late model VCR like S Video even. Yeah. So like that's a cheap way to do it, but it's messy. Or you can buy these like almost purpose built, like for retro gamers. It's like a UHF, VHF, NTSC, PAL tuner thing, and that does the same thing as the VCR. It's just a little bit more elegant. It's the same exact thing. I'm like, well, I better make sure this ColecoVision powers on, right? Because I won't be able to get a picture, but I'll be able to see a scrambled picture even on a digital tuner. Mm-hmm. So I plugged it in, and a new menu appeared on my TV because it detected an analog source. And ColecoVision works perfectly on my 2-year-old Sony XBR HD TV. It works brilliantly. There isn't even any of that sort of like raster flicker that you get.
Or underscan or overscan. Yeah.
No, and it's scaled to widescreen. Like a purist would freak out when they saw it, because they're presumably, but with ColecoVision graphics, like, doesn't look bad at all.
Yeah. So they're arcade perfect. Yeah.
I would be playing Ladybug, Space Fury, and what did I just pick up? I
About
picked it up.
Zaxxon.
No, Zaxxon and Donkey Kong. Like, I just looped through those so many times in my
You're done. Yeah.
Quest for Quintana Roo, which was
Oh,
like
yeah.
the Raiders of the Lost Ark with ColecoVision.
Yep. Okay. What are you going to watch and what are you going to drink?
I am going to drink a lot of sparkling water because I had an accident. I have to take a lot of horse pills. I have to take these giant Tylenol for my broken collarbone, and I'll be drinking a lot of sparkling water.
Yeah, you can't really mix alcohol with serious drugs.
No, and I have, I always stopped drinking in January and do this like dry January thing, and I've gone a year and a half, but with no particular plan. Like
I did the same thing. The last time I had a
I
drink
almost-
was
yeah.
February 28th of last year. Since the
Yeah, no,
pandemic
mine
started,
was-
I have not had a drop of
Yeah.
alcohol.
Well, that was the thing. I'd done January and I was going in February, and I was like, oh my God, I can't last till Cinco de Mayo. And then the pandemic hit, and I was like,
Yeah.
well, let's just keep, like, when Kramer's running out of gas in Seinfeld, let's just see where it goes.
Yeah.
But the good news is I haven't felt any benefits from that whatsoever, and it's been a complete waste of time. So I might just go.
I haven't felt any different either. I'll be honest with
No,
you.
I'm
Quitting
still
drinking,
fat.
I felt no
Yep.
different. Yeah, it didn't
Yep,
change
no different.
anything.
Yep.
And what about watching?
And,
Are you into TV and film at all?
I am. I'm way behind on Falcon and the Winter Soldier.
Okay.
I always want to call him the Winter Snowman. My daughter loved. I've been watching a lot of like things with her. She got me to watch Harry Potter. Not for me.
Yeah.
She got me to watch WandaVision. Loved that.
Yep.
And we've got to catch up on Falcon and Winter Soldier. And I've been rereading a Gene Wolfe book. Because all I can do to work out is go on a recumbent bike. So I've been listening to an audiobook on that, which is the Wizard, Knight and Wizard. It's two books, and it's called Wizard Knight in compilation. But yeah, Falcon and the Winter Soldier.
Awesome. Where can folks find you on social media, and where can they find Halo Infinite as well?
I am at Frankles on Twitter. Halo Infinite, go to halowaypoint.com. But there's, as we get closer to launch, there will be more and more things that you'll want to go to xbox.com for some sort of premieres and stuff. And that's Facebook is just for angry aunts and relatives demanding to know where I am. Yeah, that's me.
All right. Well, Frank, thank you so much. I know you're really busy right now. Best of luck wrapping up Halo Infinite. I cannot wait to play it.
Yeah, we're very excited. It's definitely my sweet spot for what I think Halo is. And we had this conversation. Everyone's is different.
Yep.
But like there's a lot of, for as much as I go on about how you can't let nostalgia drive your thing, there's a lot of nostalgia in this that I think people will love. And it's a really sweet spot for me in terms of what I like doing in games, which is I like having this like really predictable sort of solid combat encounters, and I like my big team battles. But I like exploring, and I like wandering off and seeing there better be a rocket launcher in this cave, and hearing Joe say and say, "How could there be a rocket launcher in this cave? You're the first human to ever come here." So that's what I'm looking forward to.
Awesome. Well, thanks again for talking to us, and have yourself a great weekend.
You too. Thanks so much. Been blessed.
Now that we know what Frank is doing with this weekend, it's time for us to do you.
Games!
It's a slow weekend for game releases, but we have one huge one. Mass Effect Legendary Edition goes on sale today. It features remastered versions of the first 3 games in the franchise, and it's available now for Xbox One, PlayStation 4, and PC. If you want something a little more under the radar, Subnautica Below Zero launches for every platform, including Switch. It's a standalone expansion to the excellent waterlogged survival adventure, and initial reviews have been kind.
TV and film!
Hope you're ready to plant your ass on the couch all weekend long, because there are tons of new releases in TV and film this weekend. First up, Castlevania Season 4 debuted on Netflix yesterday. It's the final season of the animated series, and so far, fans have loved it. Next up, Love, Death, and Robots Season 2 launches on Netflix today. If you missed the first season, go back and watch it right now. It is excellent.
It is an animated anthology series, and it's available today on Netflix. Up next, Netflix is also launching a new film this weekend called Fairy. It's about a drug kingpin who sets out for revenge, and it's on Netflix right now. The biggest theatrical release of the weekend is undoubtedly Army of the Dead. It's a heist movie set in Las Vegas during a zombie apocalypse. It's only in theaters, and it is crazy gory. We're really excited for this one, so go check it out. Also in theaters is Those Who Wish Me Dead. Angelina Jolie stars in this thriller that finds a teenage witness being hunted by assassins in the Montana wilderness. It's in theaters and VOD. And yet another theatrical film. It's really great to see this as the pandemic recedes. Profile is about a female journalist who goes undercover to become an ISIS bride. It's also only in theaters. And then there's The Woman in the Window, starring Julianne Moore and Gary Oldman. This thriller is about a woman who befriends a neighbor only for her to disappear. And then finally, I told you it was a lot. Above Suspicion is a film that's appearing in theaters and VOD, and it follows an FBI agent who falls in love with a poor Kentucky woman, and it's based on real events.
Music!
Several great albums worth checking out this weekend. First up, Juliana Hatfield has a new album called Blood. She's a singer-songwriter from the Lemonheads, which is a seminal indie band from a couple decades ago. At this point, it's her 19th studio album, so check it out. Next up, St. Vincent has a new album that came out today called Daddy's Home. It follows in the same footsteps as their prior stuff, basically electronic indie rock with breathy female vocals. This album is a little different though. It has several sort of offbeat compositions, and the female vocals sound a lot like one of my favorite electro bands, The Knife. The Black Keys are back with a new album called Delta Cream. However, this is a little bit different. It is their 10th studio album, but instead of being a bunch of original songs, it's a cover album of country songs. It's rife with bluesy undertones with an indie rock sheen. And the final album we recommend that came out today is by a band called The Chills, and their new release is called Scatterbrain. It's the first album from the indie quintet in 3 years, and their 7th album total. We've liked every single song that they've released from the album thus far, and each one has its own unique tone and style.
Sports!
Here come the NHL playoffs, people. I am very, very excited about that. I know most of you probably aren't. But let's start on Friday. First, tonight at 9:30 p.m. Eastern, it's the Pelicans versus the Warriors on ESPN as the NBA starts wrapping up its regular season. Moving to Saturday, if you're a soccer fan, the Premier League has 2 games on NBC Sports Network starting at 7:15 a.m. It's Burnley versus Leeds, and then at 9:55 a.m. it's Southampton versus Fulham. If you want to check out some racing, at 1:30 p.m. it's the NASCAR Dry Dean 200 on Fox Sports 1. On to baseball, the Oakland A's take on the Twins on Fox Sports 1 at 4 p.m. And then finally on Saturday, the NHL playoffs kick off with the Bruins at the Capitals at 7:15 p.m. on NBC. Moving to Sunday, it's Penguins playoff day. But first up, the Premier League has a huge lineup on NBC Sports starting at 7 a.m. with Crystal Palace versus Aston Villa. And then at 9 a.m. it's Tottenham Hotspur versus Wolverhampton Wanderers. I love that name. At 11:25 a.m., it's West Brom versus Liverpool. And then at noon Eastern, 9 a.m. my time, and I will be up in plenty of time to watch, it's the Penguins versus the Islanders in Game 1 of their 7-game series, and that is on NBC. Moving on into the afternoon, if you like golf, at 3 p.m., it's the final round of the AT&T Byron Nelson on CBS. And then moving on into the evening, at 7 p.m. on ESPN, if you like baseball, it's the Cardinals versus the Padres. And then to cap off the weekend, at 7:30 p.m., it's Game 1 of the Lightning versus the Panthers on NBC in the NHL playoffs.
Esports!
It's a slow week for esports. No big tournaments to speak of, but there are a couple with some big purses. The Dota 2 Pinnacle Cup is going off this weekend for $100K, and then the Swing Sweet Spring #2, try to say that 3 times fast, Counter-Strike tournament is also worth $100K, and that's also going down this weekend. All right, thanks for checking out 3-Night Weekend on Sifted Games at sifted.net. A huge thanks to Frank O'Connor for letting us peek behind the Halo curtain for a bit. If you want to get 3-Night Weekend when it's hot and fresh, head to patreon.com/sifted and drop us a pledge. If you pledge at $4 a month or more, you'll get all our content early, like our flagship show Game Face and Pactor Factor, starring Michael Pactor. If you want to know when the show is posted for free on our YouTube channel, make sure to follow the site on Twitter @SiftedGames. You can also reach out to me @Dinfire if you want to suggest future guests. I'm Shane Satterfield reminding you that every weekend is a 3-Night Weekend.